Imagine living in a society where one mistake, one tragic accident could lead to your death at the hands of an avenger. This was the case in ancient Israel, but then God provided hope, a way out of this cycle of revenge and destruction, and they were called the cities of refuge. These sanctuaries were established by God Himself, and they offered safety and justice amid chaos. In Deuteronomy 19 verses 1 to 14, which we're going to cover today, we will reveal a powerful message about mercy, protection, and God's provision for His people. Today, let's explore how these ancient cities can still teach us about seeking refuge ourselves in God's grace and, importantly, extending that grace to others. So welcome to our study on the cities of refuge. I've called it Justice in and Out of Court. That's the place where divine mercy meets human need in today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, we're going to turn today to Deuteronomy chapter 19 and see what it has to say about justice. Now, some of the concepts we've already studied together as we've worked through these last few chapters particularly apply directly, well, mainly to legal and court settings. But as I've mentioned, there are elements of this teaching on justice in these chapters that extend beyond the tiers and hierarchies of authority and beyond the courtroom. Another point to note is that some commentators suggest that this section of Moses' second sermon that he's giving to the people prior to entering the Promised Land, many people see them as Moses expanding on the Ten Commandments as he goes along. In this case, what he says here relates or widens out the basic sixth commandment to not commit murder. But what he's going to do here is widen the perspective a little on that. So with that in mind, let's begin exactly where we left off last time, and I'll begin by reading verse 1 from Deuteronomy chapter 19, which tells us this. When the Lord your God has destroyed the nations whose land He is giving you, and when you have driven them out and settled in their towns and houses, then set aside for yourselves 3 cities in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. Now, before we go on a little, I need to pause and explain and remind you of a couple of things. You will recall that the book of Deuteronomy is being written on the east side of the River Jordan. I've already mentioned that. The children of Israel have come out of Egypt. They've traveled in the wilderness, but then they've moved up to the east side of Jordan, where they're at last about to enter the land. However, God has forbidden Moses himself to enter the land because of his previous disobedience. So Moses here is giving a series of sermons to prepare them for when they enter the land. And we're in the middle of the second sermon. But notice this section of his message that he believed God is telling him, inspiring him to tell the people, begins in verse 1 when he says, when the Lord your God has destroyed the nations whose land He is giving to you. So what he's doing, he's anticipating what will happen when they in fact finally cross the Jordan and enter the land on the west side of the river. And in these opening verses, he instructs them to separate 3 cities for themselves in the middle of that new area of land. But why 3 cities? Well, he's going to explain that in a minute, but what he's talking about will become clear as we read further into the passage. But at this point, I just want to say that what is being referred to, these cities, are commonly and will be again called, as we get further into the Bible, cities of refuge. I'll explain what that actually means in a moment when we get to it. But the key point here, at this point, the basic instruction has just been given to separate these 3 cities for themselves. The purpose for which they will serve will appear very shortly. Now, Moses has already instructed them way back in chapter 4 to establish 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan. Now he's talking about the west side. So if you put the 2 together, they're now going to be 6 cities, 3 in the east and 3 in the west. Okay, let's continue with the text. Look at verse 3. Determine the distances involved and divide into 3 parts the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, so that a person who kills someone may flee for refuge to one of these cities. Now we can see what's going on here. These cities are going to be the place for someone who has committed what we would today call manslaughter to flee. They are cities of refuge. He's going to elaborate on this and explain what's involved in the coming verses. But at this point, note that it just says he is to prepare the loads, divide the territory, and establish the cities. And these cities need to be equally spaced, and there needs to be roads built to them. This is obviously pointing to the fact that they're meant to be easily accessible and accessible to anyone. Some translations say who is a manslayer. We might describe it as someone who's committed manslaughter. So Moses is giving this the context, and he's building it up layer by layer. The first 3 verses simply tell us to establish 3 cities on the west side of the Jordan after they get in there, make sure they're equally spaced, but also to begin the process of building the roads between them. But now, starting in verse 4, he will explain and expand upon the purpose of these cities. It says, "This is the rule concern anyone who kills a person and flees there for safety. Anyone who kills a neighbor unintentionally, without malice aforethought." Okay, we need to pause right there. It's now clear what he's talking about. This term manslayer in the King James Version is a term that is being used of someone who has killed another person, and here's the key, unintentionally. Now today, of course, we call this manslaughter, or the other degrees of causing death by misadventure or through carelessness, etc. So this part of the passage is basically addressing someone who has committed that type of offence. Manslaughter, I'll call it for simplicity. So what does it mean to actually, what is the definition and meaning to kill someone unintentionally? Well, let's continue, and the passage will tell us. It gives an example, verse 5 and 6. "For instance, a man may go into the forest with his neighbour to cut wood, and he swings his axe to fell a tree, and the head flies off and hits the neighbour and kills him. That man may flee to one of these cities and save his life. Otherwise, the avenger of blood might pursue him in rage, overtake him if the distance is too great, and kill him, even though he's not deserving of death, since he did this to his neighbour without malice aforethought." So there's a number of things going on here, and we need to sort them out, don't we? First, we need to see that this is only talking about cases of manslaughter, death that was not intentional, and that's very important. The person did not do anything, to use the word of Moses, deserving of death, because manslaughter does not deserve the penalty of death. The illustration Moses gives us that of chopping down a tree when the head of the axe comes off and the handle kills someone. And we can imagine all sorts of modern scenarios involving accidental death, can't we, that might occur. But what's interesting in this passage, it talks about this person called the avenger of blood, who might pursue and kill the one who's committed manslaughter. So the question becomes, who and what is this avenger of blood? Well, the answer is they are the nearest relative of the deceased, the nearest living relative, essentially a family protector, someone who has that responsibility and therefore is responsible for avenging the death of a family member. Now, it was in the Old Testament it was understood that the nearest male relative, well, they had several responsibilities. For example, they could redeem another relative out of slavery. That was outlined for us in Leviticus 25. They could also redeem a relative's property, also shown in Leviticus. They can even marry a relative's widow and raise her children up in the name of the deceased. But here's the thing, they could also avenge the death of a relative, which is what this passage is about. So the avenger is the near kinsman, the closest relative, male relative. He, in fact, was responsible for killing someone who had killed one of his relatives. Certainly, if it was intentional, but you could understand how this could spill over, even if it was unintentional. Now, today, we don't have anything like this. The state steps in to handle all such matters today in terms of guilt and the apportionment of punishment. But at this point, remember, this is early in what historians call the prehistory period. There isn't a sophisticated government structure in those days. In fact, it's beginning to be established here in the Pentateuch, the early books of the Bible. But this near relative had the responsibility of being what was called the avenger of blood. But in terms of the Levitical law at that time, it wasn't really seen as a judicial matter. In the modern sense, we might describe even something as dramatic as this as being a family affair. So let's look at verse 7. That is why I commanded you to set aside for yourself these cities. Okay, because this person, well, they've killed someone unintentionally, what we would generally define as manslaughter today, but they're still in danger of being killed by this near relative. And in this circumstance, they are able to flee to one of these cities of refuge and live there without being allowed to be killed by this person called the Avenger of Blood. Now, we know from other passages in Scripture that the one who had committed manslaughter had to stay in the cities of refuge until the death of the current high priest. If he chose to leave that city of refuge before the high priest had died, then the Avenger of Blood could indeed kill him, and if they did so, they themselves wouldn't be guilty of murder. That's stated for us and how it's worked out in Numbers chapter 35. So these cities of refuge are an interesting concept in ancient Israel, maybe hard for us to get our heads around today. The concept seems foreign to us, I'm sure. But I suppose a comparison might be fleeing to another country where if you go there, there's no extradition agreement, therefore you can't be prosecuted for that crime in that place. However, if that person left that country and returned back to their home country, they would of course be vulnerable for the consequences of their action to fall upon them. Why did God establish these cities of refuge in the first place? Well, some suggest, and I agree, that these cities were God's way of teaching Israel about the importance and the sanctity of life. Even though a man had killed someone accidentally, he still had to give up a large measure of his freedom for a period of time. So this underscores the value of life and the seriousness of being involved in taking a life, even unintentionally. And this much is clear if you just sit down and read these 7 verses together. But then a little segue appears, a bump in the road, so to speak. Look at verse 8. It says, if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he promised an oath to your ancestors, and gives you the whole land he promised them, because you carefully follow all these laws I command you today, to love the Lord your God, to walk always in obedience to him, then you are to set aside 3 more cities, and do this so that the innocent blood will not be shed in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as your inheritance, so that you will not be guilty of bloodshed. So interestingly, if they progress, as God says, and the land gets bigger, and they establish the whole of the promised land that's been promised them, then he says 3 more cities, even more cities are to be established. Now, as I explained earlier, Moses designated 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan in chapter 4 and 3 cities on the west side of the Jordan in this passage. Now he's saying there could potentially be 3 more cities, making a total of 9. So where do these other cities come from? Well, he explains that if they keep the commandments, they love the Lord, they walk in their ways, then God will expand their territory. Now, this then becomes a bit of a theological issue. God promised Abraham the land that extends from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. Now, when they first conquered the land under Joshua, they did not acquire all of that territory. Under David and Solomon's reign, they did indeed gain more land, but then this raises the debate. Some say that the promise to Abraham was fulfilled under David and Solomon as they conquered the land. And as they moved through and widened their sphere of influence, they continued to be obedient to him and indeed paid tribute through sacrifices and offerings. However, others would argue, I have to say including myself, I believe that God promised the land to the nation of Israel forever, and they didn't actually fully occupy it, even in the biblical history of the whole canon of Scripture. They may have conquered it, but they never completely settled it completely. They forced the inhabitants to pay tribute. They subdued the land to a great extent, but Israel did not fully occupy these lands and, in a sense, hand them over to God in the way first described to Abraham back in Genesis. And this passage indicates that if and when they were to receive the full territory, that promise to Abraham, then if and when that happens, which of course is dependent on obedience, then they should set up 3 more cities. There is no indication, I believe, however, in the Old Testament that they ever established these 3 cities. Further evidence to suggest that the land was never fully established and has not yet been fully established in the way described in Genesis. However, God is saying, if and when that ever happens, this is what they should do. Okay, what we've been talking about so far in this passage is manslaughter. This is talking about killing someone that you didn't intend to kill, what today we might also call involuntary manslaughter. Now, if you try and think of some of these cases today, the first one that immediately came into my mind was causing death while driving. Now, if you are driving, let's say you're speeding and you have an accident that results in someone's death, you can be guilty of, in the UK, of something called causing death by dangerous driving. There's a lower level of careless driving, and of course, if there's alcohol and drugs involved, it can even be a more serious offence than that. So there are tiers to this, all of them below premeditated murder, but they range from manslaughter through various tiers. The key point in all of these being described here in this passage is it's involuntary. The death was not premeditated, but someone still caused someone's death, and there has to be a penalty for that. So if we're going to discuss unintentional killing, and if we've dealt with that, then the next logical step would be for God through Moses to address the issue of intentional killing, what we call murder. And that's exactly what Moses looks at next. Look at verses 11 and 12. But if out of hate someone lies in wait, assaults and kills a neighbor, and then flees to one of these cities, the killer shall be sent by the town elders and be brought back from the city and be handed over to the avenger of blood to die. So clearly this is more in line with what we're talking about here, is a case of premeditated murder. It's clear in this case because it says he hates his neighbor and lies in wait. So this is planned, isn't it? Premeditated. If you're a fan of crime dramas or crime podcasts, you'll know that the police or the people investigating are always trying to prove whether the murder was premeditated or whether it was done in a moment of passion or whether it was just an accidental case of manslaughter. This case being talked about here, let's be clear, involves what we would today define as premeditated murder. It actually says there's hatred in their heart and they're lying in wait for them, and that's the element of pre-planning, premeditation. This type of killing, it says, is worthy of death, and this of course goes all the way back to Noah, and after the flood God told Noah that whoever kills someone in this way, that person was themselves worthy of death. So it's making sure they understand the caveat that the cities of refuge does not apply in the cases of premeditated murder. Someone cannot flee there in that situation and expect to find sanctuary there. If someone flees to a city of refuge after committing murder, then the elders of the city where the murder actually occurred can go to that city of refuge and go in there and retrieve the person and take them away or enforce them to be handed over by the civic leaders of that city, handed over to the avenger of blood in order that he can enact the sentence that he's allowed. So this is all serious business, isn't it? And it shouldn't be taken or read lightly. And there's one more verse on dealing with murder, verse 13. It actually says, show no pity. You must purge from Israel the guilt of the shedding of innocent blood, so that it may be well with you. So this passage not only says that this is to be done, but it tells the people not to show any pity to the murderer. So if you're one of the elders of the city, if you're one of the elders of the original city where this premeditated murder took place, or you're part of the community of the city of refuge itself, it says, well, don't protect this person. Actually bring him back and hand him over either to the authorities of the city where the murder took place, or literally even into the hands of this person called the Avenger of Blood. So far in this passage, in these opening 13 verses, we've been dealing with two main things. Number one was the various degrees of manslaughter, and number two is murder, specifically premeditated, pre-planned murder. But there's a third issue here, which on the surface just appears to be dealing with the lesser crime of stealing, or the one particular sort of stealing. So let's read the verse. Now, it might not initially strike you as very significant. You might not even recognize it from the text as actually being even theft. But that's what it amounts to, and it's what it leads to that's important. So look and listen to verse 14. It says, "Do not move your neighbor's boundary stone, set up by your predecessors in the inheritance you received in the land your Lord is giving you to possess." Okay, we need to explain these things called landmarks, boundary stones. These were stones placed to indicate the boundary of a piece of property. When the Israelites entered the land, Moses said the Lord is going to divide the land up among the tribes, didn't he? And then among the families within the tribes. And each family would be given what is called a parcel of land. And that parcel of land would be marked by the placings of stones. Now, some people, it seems, and we'll discover, would get up in the middle of the night and move the stones to give themselves more property. This was a common practice, in fact, in the ancient world. Moving stones was the equivalent of stealing, but it was also the equivalent of stealing a family's inheritance. Now, according to extra-biblical material, historical material, apparently this was a widespread problem in this part of the ancient world. Now, such a sort of thing is harder today because we have surveyors and official land registry records, but back then it was more primitive. You just laid out stones and you moved stones and you got more property. And Moses said specifically, don't do that. Now, even though it was a common problem in the ancient world, it wasn't completely unknown in Israel. And of course, the Lord wanted to protect the people from falling into this type of activity once they got into the promised land, where apparently it was rife among the Canaanite nations. Now, the book of Proverbs mentions these landmark stones several times, and they're also mentioned in the book of Hosea. So the problem occurred enough for Moses, and then again, in fact, later Solomon to address it. But why does Moses specifically brings it up here? Well, some suggest, and I'm inclined to as well, if you actually understand the context where through this lengthy second sermon, Moses is actually following up and expanding on the 10 Commandments, and remember in this one he's discussing the commandment against murder, then people have pointed out that the moving of these landmarks may be connected in some way to murder. Moving landmarks was often the catalyst that caused such hostility between families that it would indeed lead to murder in those days. So this is being suggested is just addressing the same issue of situations that could lead to death, killing, murder, premeditated murder, but trying to deal with it at the root. And that's what these cities of refuge, the issues they're addressing and what they're all about. But the important thing to notice also is these cities of refuge were more than just physical sanctuaries. They were divine symbols of God's justice, mercy, and provision, being embedded in this early society right from the beginning. So they're also there to remind us that our God is a God of second chances, a God who cares deeply about justice and at one time recognizing the sanctity of life, but also recognizing that there must be justice in how we approach the taking of the life and recognize that there are different levels to how this should be considered. Now, in these verses, we see a blueprint for a society being established that will ultimately, at its heart, value life and seek to protect the innocent whilst ensuring justice is always served. But I think it also calls from us when approaching it from a Christian perspective, to, in a sense, create spaces of refuge, safety, not just in our societies, but also in our own lives. And we do that ultimately by extending the grace of God to others in need, and to stand up for what is right when we see injustice around it. So I would say the real takeaway for us approaching this as New Testament Christians today is to go forward from this point, and it should inspire you to build your own, quote, cities of refuge in your families, your own homes, but also in your communities and in your nations. But ultimately, it starts by being open-hearted, good-willed, well-disposed to other people, so that we might even build a city of refuge in our own hearts. And we do that ultimately by being quick to offer forgiveness, to protect the vulnerable we see around us or those exploited, and to always seek justice, the justice of God, with compassion in all our dealings with people. Remember, just as God provided places of safety for his people, he calls us to be instruments today of his peace and his refuge for people in a world that desperately needs it. So the hope is that by understanding this passage and applying it in your life, you will be enabled to offer a place of refuge and a place within the safety and the protection of God, by embracing others to accept the gospel of grace, and for us to call upon all refugees of the heart to experience the grace, mercy, and justice that God wants everyone to have. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, we leave it there, friends. Thank you for being with me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all people, wherever it is, whatever time of day it is for you. I hope and trust you're wide awake and ready for another dose of divine wisdom on this issue of justice. Today we're going to look at the foundation of what will become one of the bedrocks of all our legal system and justice systems around the world, and remains so to this day. You know, it's not every day you get to dive into the world of ancient Israelite justice systems, but today is that day. So how can I make that interesting again? Well, imagine for a moment that you're back in ancient Israel. Picture yourself trying to settle a dispute with your neighbour. He accuses you of something and you accuse him right back. But instead of calling your lawyer, you're thinking, whoa, I really need to get a couple of reliable witnesses to back me up on this, or things are going to get really awkward or really dangerous really fast. And this is what Deuteronomy 19 verses 15 to 21 is all about. It's in this passage where God lays down the law about the calling of witnesses and how to deal with false witnesses, and the importance of always telling the truth. Spoiler alert, friends, if you're caught lying under this system, you're not just in danger of your pants catching fire, you really are in some serious trouble under this ancient Israelite justice system. So, perk up, pay attention as we explore what happens when witnesses go rogue, and how God's justice can still prevail, and why honesty really is the best policy, even when you're tempted to stretch the truth a little. Welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, friends, let's dive straight in, jumping straight away, and see what this 3,500-year-old ancient passage has to say about truth, justice, and see how it plays out in what is probably the equivalent of the ancient world's courtroom drama. What plays out for us today relates primarily to events that have descended to such a point where things need to be taken to court. So let's begin at the beginning, so to speak, verse 15, and it says this: "One witness is not enough to conduct anyone accused of any crime or offence. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Wow, very simple, very straightforward. You've got to have proof, and you need witnesses. Witnesses plural. Now, we talked about various offences yesterday: manslaughter, murder, and even stealing. But now he's saying, when it comes to accusing someone of any crime, any of those crimes or any crime at all, you've got to have proof. One person saying it is not proof. You've got to have 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, one commentator I read on this in my preparation said that this principle was meant to act as a safeguard against false witnesses being purchased or brought up, maybe close family members, to bring an untruthful charge against another fellow Israelite because of some sort of quarrel they were having, and the fact that it was out of impure motives. You see, by requiring more than one witness, requiring at least 2 or 3, then greater accuracy and objectivity and proof was of course required. So you've got to have proof before you can accuse someone of anything. That principle exists still today, doesn't it, friends? And that proof should be at the very least 2 or better 3 or more witnesses. Okay, look at the next verses 16 and 17. If a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse someone of a crime, the 2 people involved in this dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priests and the judges who are in office at that time. So what it's saying here, if there's been a squabble outside in the country somewhere and there's a suspicion that there's false witnesses involved and someone's been accused by these people, then if that can't be decided and established completely at the lower court, then you have to haul all these people into the tabernacle and judge them there before the priest and the judges and of course God himself. So that's what it means here. Drag him before the Lord, they're saying, who at time, remember, was actually dwelling in the tabernacle at the time this was written, and this is also the place where the priests and the judges were. So in other words, by today's equivalent, you've got to take him to the equivalent of the highest court in the land. The High Court, it's called in the UK, the Supreme Court. It may have different names in the countries that you're listening to. But the point of all this is that it's going to be brought before the Lord and his representatives in the tabernacle. But underpinning that whole process is the assumption that the person originally accused must remain innocent until proven guilty. And you've got to have 2 or 3 witnesses, because if it was just one and they were the accuser, then the fellow being accused, that is not enough. So the fellow being accused in this situation, behind all of this stuff, is protected by the principle of what we would call today innocent until proven guilty. Now look at the next couple of verses. The judges must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony against a fellow Israelite, then do to the false witness or witnesses as that witness intended to do to the other party. You must purge the evil from among you. Okay, so if you're one of these false witnesses and you've been brought in and you're accusing someone falsely, whatever the punishment for the crime that you're falsely accusing them of, you will pay with that punishment. Now, this is similar today, is when people sue somebody and the judge ends up saying, no, you don't have the evidence. You can't prove they're guilty of what you're accusing them. And I suppose today, the way that's addressed through a judicial system, you hear about these cases where the person not only has to pay their own legal fees, but they've got to pay the other person's lawyer and legal fees as well if the case doesn't go the way they hoped. But in this situation, what we see is the false witness, because they've gone before the court and spoken falsely, they'll receive the very punishment that they sought to bring upon the person whom they falsely accused. It then says in verse 20, the rest of the people will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. So in other words, all of this whole process, its ultimate purpose is to be a deterrent amongst the wider community. Now, some people today argue that punishment doesn't in fact deter crime. But I would say It does when it's practiced correctly, when justice is practiced correctly. And certainly in those days, it probably did have that deterrent effect. In those days, if you lived in a small town and someone's relative were killed or a crime like a theft was committed, everyone would immediately know about it. News would spread quickly and justice was usually very swift. Courts were convened within the day and justice was dispensed at this time. And then finally, in verse 21, this whole process is rounded up with the comment that they are to show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So, if the person is found guilty, then the children of Israel, the whole nation, were not to have compassion on that guilty person. They were to demand the proportionate punishment for the crime committed. Now, when we read something like this today and it says hand for hand, foot for foot, it sounds brutal. It sounds like we're called to mutilate someone, or certainly they were in their day. So I think this needs to be commented on. We can't avoid it, even if we understand it solely from the perspective of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. Now, one thing I found helpful to help me interpret this was when I read a commentator who pointed out that this was not so much giving a license to do these things, but actually to set an upper limit of punishment that no one would be allowed to go beyond. Let me explain. In the ancient world, prior to the Levitical law, absolutely certainly in the land they were about to go into, if you were caught committing any crime, like even stealing, you could be killed for that. And the person who killed you, the person who'd been the victim of your crime, of maybe the theft of something insignificant, if they killed you, they would have been not guilty of any transgressions of the law or the moral codes at that time. So God here through Moses, in this ancient context, is actually setting a limit. It says if someone steals, as an example, then you're certainly not allowed to kill that person. In fact, the highest level of punishment at most would be the cutting off of the offending hand. So there is to be punishment, but now there are to be limits set upon it, and those punishments can only apply to the immediate felon, not their family. Now, beyond that, it's worth noting that there is no indication in the whole of the Old Testament that they ever did enact this level of punishment in ancient Israel. The law laid down the possibility, but there was no case in the Bible where we actually see this being done. Instead, we see punishments where financial restitution has to be made, and if it's as a result of theft, at a higher multiple than that which was taken. So the point of these verses, when properly understood, is actually to see them as setting a limit, so that only the punishment that is deserved can be given. Never to go above and beyond that. But then there's this added little caveat, but don't fall into the trap of confusing compassion with leniency. You've got to deal with the crime, and there still needs to be punishment in some way. Now, all of this is as relevant as today's newspaper, isn't it? Right now, I see arguments raising all around us where some people are saying that we should have compassion on criminals. I've literally heard some people argue that the criminal is really the one who is the victim because they grew up poor or they were uneducated. So they are, in fact, a victim of their environment and the society in which we all live. So I told you this is relevant stuff because what this is really pointing out to us that there are two very different views of the world when it comes to this. The biblical view is very clear that regardless of your background or your situation, when you commit a crime, you are responsible for that crime and the punishment which comes. And we see here in this passage the first time of many where this principle is taught. Now, there's a culture war going on in the world today on this as well as many other issues, because the other worldview is that the problem is not individuals' depravity, but it is their environment. People have some misfortune in life, which is why they become criminals, it says. But if that were the case, why don't all people who have misfortune or poor backgrounds or disadvantages end up criminals? Of course they don't. So I don't believe that argument is even logical. So like I said, this is really, really relevant stuff. And this caveat at the end is an important one, because we're not to have a false sense of compassion on those who commit crime. If they are proven guilty, then society needs to decide the punishment, and we should not ever confuse compassion with undue leniency, because that in itself will mean there will be no deterrent and crime may very well increase. Okay, let's try and summarize all of this. The summary of it is simple. If you're called to dispense justice, and you may think, well, am I? Well, anybody serving a jury or anyone called to dispense justice or to be part of the criminal justice system in any way should keep in mind, firstly, that the accused are innocent until proven guilty, and that the evidence of guilt must be convincing, and that there should be a thorough investigation, and thereafter the punishment should be commensurate with the crime. And if that justice system is played out perfectly, enacted in that way, it will serve as a deterrent. Now, I went through this all pretty quickly, so I'm going to repeat the key things that I think are important for us to draw out of this. Number one, embedded in this passage, is the principle, shown here for the first time, that people are innocent until proven guilty. We kind of have imbibed that so much that we just accept it as an underlying principle of all things, and we never even think about where it actually came from, which is here. And how do we establish if someone is in fact guilty? Then it's the fact that a high bar has to be set. One witness won't do. You've got to have two or better three. Number two is that evidence of guilt must be convincing. We could have situations where we have witnesses, but they turn out to be false witnesses. So there's got to be proof as well as witness statements, which is why the judges and the priests in this situations are called to investigate, as it says in this passage, to inquire carefully. So they've got to gather the evidence. And then thirdly, finally, the punishment should be commensurate with the crime, at such a level that it serves as a deterrent. And I would say our whole modern world judicial systems, certainly in democratic countries, are built on these concepts. We actually hear people talk about Western civilization being built on the Judeo-Christian values, don't we? And that's very much what we're talking about here. These are the very things that I've mentioned. Things like you're innocent until you're proven guilty, witnesses are required to convict anybody, and that the guilty should be punished, but only to a level that is commensurate with the crime. Now, I want to tell you, in many countries around the world today, you're still very often guilty unless you can prove yourself innocent. And also, one of the really horrible things about today is that people are being accused and automatically crucified in public opinion before they're even given a chance before going to court, where at least some sort of careful inquiry could be done to see if people were really guilty or not. We're moving further and further from these principles established here every day, and that's a very sad state of affairs in the countries in which we live. We need to make the presumption of innocence, and if we want to go beyond that, there needs to be evidence, there needs to be witnesses, and we need to ensure that the punishment is commensurate with the crime. And another factor that comes out of this, and it's occurred to me a few times as I've been studying through these Levitical laws and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and it's something that I don't think I've ever heard anyone, preacher, minister, talk about this. But have you ever noticed, I certainly did, that there are no jails in the Bible except those of the occupying Roman authorities or other authoritarian regimes depicted in the Old and the New Testament? Let me say it another way. There are no jails in the Mosaic Law. The law never calls for anyone to be put in jails. There are cities of refuge. They're different from jails, for they're a place to protect people from avengers of justice when they've done something accidentally. But there are no jails in the biblical justice system and the solution to crime as revealed in the Mosaic Law. If it's a murder under the Old Testament, it's capital punishment, in some cases only. If it was robbery, the thief was to pay back the person anything up to fourfold what they've taken. So there was capital punishment, but do you notice there was no jails, just cities of refuge? Now, I don't pretend to know how we could apply the principles of having no jail societies today, but certainly I think there's an implicit call there that our jails should stand not just as places of locking people up and incarceration, but at some level surely they must be part of a rehabilitation process that enables people, upon serving their just punishment and later being released back into the world, to be able to be useful members of the societies in which we live. Okay, I'll leave that part of it there. But one other thing I want to say about this is I absolutely believe that these principles still apply outside of the court in our everyday life. Sure, we practice these principles today in our modern judicial systems. In fact, I would say our whole legal system is built upon these principles, but I think these things are also something we need to take note of in our personal lives, our Christian personal lives. What I'm going to do in closing is read an article. Someone said it more eloquently than I. In 1967, Dr. Mike DeHaan, who was a medical doctor, by the way, who turned pastor, wrote an article on this passage, and this is what he says on these specific verses. Moses, under inspiration, warns us against one of the greatest evils in the world, condemning someone on insufficient evidence. To establish an accusation, it must be attested to by at least 2 or 3 authentic witnesses. It must not be just hearsay, but factual knowledge. No court in the land will accept hearsay testimony or convict someone until both sides have been heard. Yet among Christians, the admonition of the Bible is often forgotten. We should never receive an accusation or charge against anyone unless it has been proven by at least 2 or 3 eyewitnesses. If someone comes to you today with a subdued voice and a whisper and says, "Did you hear about brother so-and-so?" or "I was told that so-and-so did such and such," you should actually refuse to listen to them. Instead, you should ask, "Do you know that to be true for a fact?" Irresponsible gossip and unsupported rumours are the cause of more trouble in the world than any other factor. It would be wise for us as Christians to follow the customs of the court. Before taking the witness stand against anyone, the clerk always asks you to raise your hand and swear that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. What headaches, what sorrow, what distress and ruin are caused by telling only half of the truth? Beware, for one of the most subtle of all lies is the lie called a half-truth, because remember, you might be hearing the wrong half. Now that's wise counsel indeed. So as I close today our study of closing verses of Deuteronomy 19, I think we need to be reminded of the fact of the wisdom and justice that is embedded in God's law, and they were placed within our society from the beginning of things. But what do we do with these verses today? What do they tell us about how we should live our lives as Christian believers? Well, these verses, of course, focus on the principles of truth and justice. They teach us how important it is to have integrity in our life, honesty and accountability. God's requirement for multiple witnesses before acting against someone or accusing someone of wrongdoing is a testament to God's commitment to justice and to protect us from false accusations. It underscores the necessity of thoroughness and fairness in all our judgments, because that's what protects us as individuals from false judgments and accusations that be made against us, thereby ensuring always that truth prevails. In a world where misfortune and quick judgment, particularly in our social media environment, can lead to hugely impactful and unjust consequences on people's lives, this principle stands high as a beacon of God's enduring wisdom against a background today of trial by social media. But these verses also highlight the importance of our personal accountability. The warning against false witnesses is clear. Those who bear false testimony against anyone are to receive the punishment intended for the accused. This principle should not only deter dishonestly, but upholds the sanctity of truth in all our communities. It calls for us as Christians to be people of integrity, peoples whose words can be trusted and who seek to build others up rather than tear them down. The fact is, we're called to be fair, honest, and just always in all of our dealings. We are called to uphold the truth, to be diligent in our judgment, and to stand against these types of falsehoods and deceptions when we see them. And by doing that, by doing these things, we actually reflect God's character to other people, and we contribute to the society, a society that values justice and integrity. So be encouraged, I think, to live out the principles that we've seen revealed here and to do it every day. Always to remain vigilant in seeking the truth and be courageous in standing up for justice and be compassionate in our dealings with others. But not to confuse compassion with leniency. By embodying all these values, I believe we can become instruments at some level of God's justice and mercy in the world around us in which we live. Remember, God's justice, friends, is not just about punishment, but it is also about restoration and righteousness. And may we, through our individual actions, shine that spotlight into the world, fostering our communities, the people around us, with truth, justice, so that God's love can prevail in the world in which we live. Thanks for being with me today. The expression rules of engagement, I'm sure you've heard it, is a military term defining the circumstances, conditions, degree, and manner in which the use of force is permitted in war. But did you know that this concept we today call rules of engagement, is actually as old as Moses himself? In the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses was preparing the children of Israel to cross the Jordan River, enter the Promised Land, and conquer it, he gave them a number of specific rules. Today, we would call these rules of engagement because they pertain how to engage in warfare, in this case, when they cross over the west of the Jordan and conquer this new land. Now, that might not sound immediately relevant to us today if you're not in the military or if you're not currently at war. So how do we relate what happens to Deuteronomy chapter 20 to everyone in our everyday life? Well, the answer is these principles apply way beyond just military warfare. They apply in our everyday and our spiritual lives. And that's what we're going to look at today in today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, friends, today we turn our attention to a new chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 20. But before I look at the first verse, I want to mention that throughout the book of Deuteronomy, if you've been with us for this journey, you will note that Moses is addressing the people. He's giving a series of talks to the people before they enter the Promised Land. And many recognize that these talks, one and the same time, to be teaching the people, but also readdressing in more details the Ten Commandments. In this case, this passage could be said to relate to the unpacking of the sixth commandment. In chapter 19, he talked about theft, murder, manslaughter, and now he's going to talk about war. Some have said that war is simply the continuation of politics by other means, because it is in warfare we see the real world challenge of how we approach issues like murder, manslaughter, the difference between them, and even theft, the taking of other people's resources. One other observation I'd like to make is this passage we're going to look at today, this chapter, falls into two distinct parts. In the first half, Moses talks about preparing for war, and in the second half, he actually talks about engaging in war. So there are two sets of rules to speak here, those for preparing for battle, followed by several rules and guidelines for actually engaging in battle. So let's begin with how we're to prepare for war. Verse 1 says, "When you go out to war against your enemies, and you see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, will be with you." So the first rule in preparing for war is very simply not to be afraid. Even if the enemy is more numerous, you're not to be afraid. The reason is given. That being is, if the war that you're going to persecute is a just one in the eyes of God, then the Lord your God will be with you. Additionally, in this opening verse, reminds them that this God who will be with them is the one who brought them out of the land of Egypt. So Moses, he refers several times, and he does it here again, to their deliverance as a people from Egypt as a way to encourage them to obey and trust in God, indicating that the Lord has always been faithful. That was the case in the past, and it will be with them now in this uncertain present that they're facing. The outcome of any battle, it says, will not ultimately be determined by mere military strength. It is based upon God's proven faithfulness. So the first rule in preparing for battle is not to fear, and trusting that the Lord God is with them, just as he's been in the past. Now, although this passage is primarily directed at the nation of Israel as they prepare for this particular battle and challenge they face, I think it's appropriate to say that it still can be applied today to all the battles of every type that we might face in life, and that includes spiritual warfare. Remember, we are in a battle. We are fighting against the world, the flesh, and the devils. And sometimes when we know that and experience that, we might have fear. We might fear what we face. So perhaps this first rule can help us to understand that in any situation, do not fear. The Lord your God is with you. In times of trials, adversities, or troubles, we are, of course, inclined to be nervous, even afraid, but the scripture here is telling us that we need not fear. Now, someone once noted that the expression "fear not" appears in the Bible 365 times, which is an amazing coincidence. Someone said, look, it's once for each day of the year. Now, whether or not that count is accurate, I've never checked, but it certainly illustrates to me that we should not fear or be afraid in any situation on any day of the year. Moving on, the second principle in the preparation for engagement in warfare is given in verses 2 to 4, and it says this: "When you're about to go into battle, the priest shall come forward and address the army, and he shall say, 'Hear, Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against the enemies and to give you victory.'" Now, at first glance, this might just seem a repetition of what we heard in verse 1. Now, there's truth in that, but there are some key differences. You see, in verse 1, we saw Moses say, "Do not be afraid." And in verses 2 to 4, it is a priest who says, "Do not let your heart be faint. Do not be afraid. Do not tremble. Do not be terrified." So it's clearly an emphatic repetition of the command not to fear, not to be afraid. But there are differences. Note, Moses is the speaker in verse 1, where in verses 2, 3, and 4, it is a priest that is speaking to the people. I don't think you can fail to notice this priest that in this role sounds very much like what we today call a military chaplain, because the priest is given a direct commission of encouragement, a command from God that he is to be there and be that for the nation of Israel, particularly its army. And I think that's a good illustration for what we might today call the role of a military chaplain, who is to provide spiritual guidance for the people, for the army, particularly in times and before battle. So the principle of "do not fear and trust the Lord is with you" are crucial for the Israelites as they prepare for battle. These principles also apply to us today in our personal and spiritual battles. The Lord your God goes with you. A point that was implied in verse 1 is explicitly unpacked here in verses 2, 3, and 4. And additionally, it mentions also that the Lord will in fact save you. Now, remember, in the Old Testament context, the word save isn't just always about salvation of the souls. Also, it can mean to deliver from safety. The context determines its meaning. We have to be always careful about that when we see this word save. Sometimes people think it's always, particularly Christians, referring to salvation, which it sometimes does. But here, given the context, it clearly refers to a military deliverance, victory, safety, not spiritual salvation. So while the principle of God's presence is implied in verse 1, it's strongly emphasized of the benefits of it in verse 2, what it means when the Lord God is truly with you and your cause is just. And it tells us that if that's the case, then you should trust him. While you may see victory, while you may use your military and strategy and strength in these real world examples, you are not relying on those alone ever, but on the sovereign God of the universe. So the first rule engaging in battle is beforehand to remember to not be afraid. Second, it is to trust the Lord. So an important thread through these verses is that this reason for our confidence is given in the reminder that the Lord has been faithful in the past, and he will continue to be faithful in the present situation that you're facing, as well as in the future. Now, as Christian believers today, I believe we too can recall God's past faithfulness in our lives. We can remember situations where we faced adversity, and we can draw strength from the fact that his promise has been seen to never leave us or forsake us. So the encouragement lies there, whether we're approaching it from a historical context or in our lives today and the challenges we face. Now, at this point in the text, something interesting happens. We've been talking about preparing for battle, but not yet engaging it. And verses 1, 2, 3, and 4 dealt with the approach to the battle. But now in verses 5 through 8, we're going to see some surprising additional instructions given on this preparation side of warfare. Verse 5 says, "The officer shall say to the army, has anyone built a new house and not yet begun to live in it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle, and someone else may begin to live in it." That might seem strange at first. It's saying if you build a house and you've not actually dedicated it, then you are instructed to go home. Then it adds another caveat. Has anyone planted a vineyard and not begun to enjoy it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle, and someone else enjoy that. So if you've planted a vineyard as well, there's also a caveat. If you haven't enjoyed its fruit yet, then go home. Another is given. Has anyone been pledged to a woman and not married her? Let him go home, or he may die in battle, and someone else may marry her. So he's saying, literally, if you're engaged but not getting around to getting married yet, you should go home and get married. And then finally, verse 8 states, "Then the officer shall add, if anyone is afraid or faint-hearted, let him go home, so that his fellow soldiers will not become disheartened." So finally, it's saying even those who are afraid and faint-hearted, they should go home. The repetition of not fearing in the context of these exemptions, I think, is important. These verses suggest that unfinished business or fear could be a distraction in battle. Therefore, it is better for both the individuals and, importantly, the rest of the army, if such people, it's actually better if they simply go home. Now, there are a couple of points to draw from this. First of all, something about distractions. Unfinished projects, unfulfilled personal commitments can distract people from the focus that they will need for battle. If your mind is preoccupied with all these worries, then you're better off out of it. And fear has to be dealt with as well. Fear, you see, can be contagious. So if someone in the army is fearful, that fear could spread, and it could even weaken the morale of the entire group. It might dampen the spirits of the army. It might even cause that fear and lack of commitment to spread. So these people are given exemptions. The nicest way I can put it is for either humanitarian reasons or simply for reasons of military morale. You see, preparing for battle involves ensuring that those who go into it have a just cause and are not afraid, and that they're in a position where nothing is going to distract them from wholeheartedly engaging in the battle the Lord has put before them. And then verse 9 continues this first section when it says, when the officers has finished speaking to the army, they shall appoint commanders over it. So once these people who were not, shall we say, ready for battle have been sent home, the remaining forces then are to be organized. Now, this passage reminds me of Gideon, who we meet very shortly in the book of Judges, and how he tested his men before a great battle, ending up with a much smaller but a really committed force. And Moses seems to be teaching in the same way that often a smaller, dedicated group is better than a larger, half-hearted one. Okay, that's the first half of this passage, and it's teaching us, it's teaching them, and it's teaching us how to prepare for battle. A reminder, by not fearing, trusting the Lord, and ensuring there are no distractions amongst those who are going to serve in this way. This principle is vital for both physical and spiritual battles, anything that we might face today. But now in the second part of the passage, the focus switches onto the actual engagement, the persecution of war, the battle. And Moses begins by providing a rather surprising opening directive. Verse 10, when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. Now, the instructions might seem odd, given that in other passages where we saw God command the total elimination of the Canaanites. Do remember those abominations included child sacrifice. That's important. However, Moses seems to be clarifying here that the initial approach to a battle should be an offer of peace, indicating that unnecessary bloodshed should be avoided where possible. So there's an underscore here that Israel's wars are not to be based just on aggression or personal gain, but there should be some goal of ultimately aiming to subdue the land to bring about peace. Verse 11 continues, if they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labour and shall work for you. So if the city accepts the offer of peace, the inhabitants become subject to Israel and will serve them, emphasizing that peace and subjugation were always preferred over destruction. Verse 12 then provides the other scenario. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in a battle, lay siege to that city. So if peace is rejected, Israel is to besiege the city, and verse 13 and 14 will tell them how to do that and what to do next. And it says, when the Lord God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take that as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord gives you from your enemies. So the spoils of war here, including women and children, are to be spared, possibly allowing them to be introduced to Israel's faith. Now, historically, women in the ancient world would normally adopt their husband's religion, which might explain this unusual provision. Conversely, though, we know that when it's Canaanite cities involving Canaanite women like Jezebel, there is always the danger that it could influence the Israelites negatively, leading them towards idolatry. But what we need to understand, there's a distinction going on here between Canaanite cities and cities that are further afield. Verse 15 will help us understand the distinction. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. So Moses is emphasizing here that these instructions, the ones I've just given you, about sparing people, they apply to cities far off, those not in the immediate promised land, so therefore not the Canaanite cities. The Canaanites are the ones who are listed explicitly, and we find out in the next verses that they're to be utterly destroyed due to their abominations, and none of these other caveats and exceptions in how they're approached are to be applied to them. Verses 16 to 18 tell us, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord has commanded you. Otherwise they will teach you to follow all their detestable ways that they do in worshipping their gods, and by doing so you will sin against the Lord your God. So the rationale here for these cities in the immediate promised land as they cross over the river is total destruction. And it's to prevent the Israelites from adopting these inhabitants, these Canaanite tribes' sinful practices, which would ultimately lead them away from God. This strict approach underscores the severity, not of the Israelite army, but it underscores the extreme severity of the Canaanite sin and the need to maintain spiritual purity when entering in amongst such people. Now, if I was to summarize this entire passage up to this point, this passage delineates two distinct strategies for engaging in battle. It's saying for the cities far away, offer peace first. If accepted, the city is subjected and thereafter becomes part of the greater Israel in a subservient role. But if it rejects it, the offer of peace, then besiege and conquer it and spare the women and children. For the Canaanite cities, however, complete destruction is required to prevent the Israelites from being influenced by their abominable practices. And we shall see how indeed that will be true in the future as we work our way through the Bible together. But these principles highlight the importance first of peace as the primary objective, and alongside this necessity of maintaining spiritual integrity in the face. This utter destruction is ultimately to prevent the Israelites from adopting the abominable practices of the Canaanites, which I've already mentioned. It includes not just idolatry, but child sacrifice as well. It is these actions, these things, that have ultimately brought the judgment of God upon these people. And in verse 19 now, Moses provides some specific instructions regarding the practicalities around the sieging of a city. It says, when you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down. So the directive is clear. Fruit-bearing trees are to be spared during a siege. The wider principle here, of course, being signalled, is that the Israelites are to preserve what is useful in the land and not to go in and engage in wanton destruction. A practice that was common among ancient nations and is still common among the way certain countries persecute war in the world today. This preservation signaled here is a sign of respect for God's creation and practical wisdom when approaching those most challenging of events in life, in this case warfare. They are to consider the land of Canaan and to consider the resources of it, these things that will ultimately come into Israel's possession. And verse 20 clarifies, saying how this works. It says, you may cut down trees that you know are not fruit trees and use them to build sieges until the city at war falls. So non-fruit-bearing trees can be used, I would assume, to build siege works. But this distinction here is to ensure that the resources that provide sustenance for the people, for the land, they're to be preserved, which I suppose highlights the importance of thought stewardship of God's creation, even in the most extreme times like war. Okay, let me summarize the second half of this passage. When engaging with war with cities outside of Canaan, the Israelites are instructed. Obviously, the overarching thing is not to be afraid, not to be distracted. Anyone with unfinished business at home should go home. Anyone who is fearful should be sent away from the force because they're going to affect morale. And when approaching and engaging a city outside of Canaan, they're instructed first to offer peace. If ultimately war then is necessary and that offer isn't taken up, then aim to win and win decisively. So these principles are all emphasizing the importance of courage and trust in God, whittling out those who are not committed, who are fearful, but always persecuting war with a preference for peace over conflict. Even when conflict becomes unavoidable, the approach is always to be measured and commensurate, and also even consider preserving useful resources, in other words, maintaining a focus at all times on the long-term well-being of the land. These ancient rules of engagement are still relevant for us as believers today. Mainly they probably apply in the spiritual battles we have in the world, against the world, the flesh and the devil. And the core principles can be applied to us and carried over to us in terms of our relationship with God and the spiritual battles that we might be facing. And the first one is to do not fear. Fear can paralyze us. It can defeat us before any battle that we need to have. Trusting in God's presence, remembering his promises, is crucial to us being able to be brave and not to fear what's coming up. Trust the Lord. Faith in God's sovereignty and goodness is foundational in spiritual battles. As the writer to the Hebrews reminds us, God has promised never to leave us or forsake us, no matter what. There's also a call here to stay focused, to avoid distractions, anything that can divert us from the mission in hand that God has given us. Just as soldiers were sent home if they were distracted by unfinished business, in this account in Deuteronomy, we too today should eliminate distractions, anything that hinders our spiritual focus and progress. But there's a call also to seek peace, isn't it? Wherever possible, no matter what conflict we're facing, our ultimate motivation should be to try and live at peace with others. As Paul writes to the Romans, he says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. This is the practical application of this principle here. But also, we're called, where necessary, to commit fully. When it turns out that conflict is unavoidable, spiritual conflict cannot be avoided, then to engage fully and decisively. Half-hearted efforts lead to failure, but wholehearted commitment is the thing that can lead to victory. So the advice offered by these principles to an army in Deuteronomy remain relevant for us today in our everyday spiritual battles. So whether the time of the real conflicts or in times today of your own personal spiritual warfare, the call here is for all believers to stand firm and be courageous, to trust in God and what he's already done in his life, remember that and be thankful, and then when no other options are available to you, engage in that spiritual battle and do it with power and with faith, always trusting and knowing that God will see you through. Thanks for being with me today. Hi everyone, welcome to today's study, which I have titled The Sacredness of Life. The plan today is to cover all of Deuteronomy 21. There are 23 verses, I think, in the whole passage. We'll just see how far we get because it actually deals with 5 points that are all got a theme running through them. And I'll just run from one to another. I've called our time together the sacredness of life because that's something that we know and are led to understand across the whole of Scripture from a biblical point of view. But today I want to ask, what are the practical ramifications of that? Well, I think in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses explores this very question in this chapter. So what I'd like us to do is look at what are actually quite little known laws that are told here that relate to, one way or another, I would suggest, the concept of the sacredness of life. Now, I believe the reasons that these 5 laws are grouped together in chapter 21, because when you look at them at first, you'll think, well, they're very different from one another. But by attaching them to the previous outworking of the legislation of the commandments, which he's been expanding and expounding upon in the second of his 3 messages in Deuteronomy, I think there is an underlying theme, his desire to get across the sacredness of life and to press upon this early covenant nation of Israel that exact idea that God wants to impress in their hearts. Now, the reason I say this is that the laws which follow in many ways aren't related to each other, but as we study them in some depth, you'll hopefully come to understand what actually ties them together is the concept of the sacredness of life. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at these 5 relatively unknown situations and laws and try and find the common theme. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, in order to do what we're going to do today, I'm going to do as my pattern is we're going to read the text and work through it verse by verse. And then at the end, we'll try and pull it all together. So the first 2 verses of Deuteronomy 21 say this: If someone is found slain lying in a field in the land the Lord has given you to possess, and it is not known who the killer was, your elders and your judges shall go out and measure the distance from the body to the neighbouring towns. That's interesting. So what's going on here? This verse is obviously talking about someone. There's been a body, they've been killed, and we don't know who did it. And the body is found out in a field somewhere. So effectively, this verse is, I suppose, talking about what today we would call an unsolved murder. And that's what this verse says. It says that the elders from the various cities near the body are to go out and to begin their investigation by measuring the distance of the corpse from the various cities. Sounds like a bit of a true crime podcast, this, doesn't it? I promise you I'm not changing the genre this week. But we do need to ask the question, why would God say they should do that? Well, the answer will be given shortly, but before we look at this, let me point out that this verse is pointing to something which is at very least an unsolved murder. Somebody has to have some kind of responsibility for looking into it, because life is important, and the fact that this man has been found dead just can't be overlooked or brushed under the carpet. That much is obvious from these opening 2 verses. Now, the reason they do the measurement is that at some point some city is going to be responsible to investigate and to figure out which city it is. It's going to be the closest city with courts that will assume the responsibility to carrying out this investigation. But what the Lord wants to do at the beginning, at this point, is to work out what that is. Now, we all know, like I said at the beginning, from a biblical point of view, life is sacred. But I think this passage begins to ask the question, what are the practical ramifications of that? How does it work out amongst us in the world in which we live? And this is the first of the 5 examples which are going to extrapolate that idea for us. As I said in the chapter, I believe this 21st chapter, Moses will explore this various question by talking through various scenarios, some of which may seem very strange to our modern ears. Anyway, let's push ahead with the first of his examples. Then the elders of the town nearest the body, so that's been established now, shall take a heifer that has never been worked and never worn a yoke, and lead it down to a valley which has not been ploughed or planted, where there is a flowing stream. There in the valley they are to break the heifer's neck. So what is all that about? Well, a heifer, you may know that, it's a young cow. And this is there to represent the murderer. It was to be his substitute. In addition, it was to be an animal that hadn't done any hard labour. And then in verse 4 it says the elders of that city shall bring that heifer down to the valley, but it's got to be one that's unused and has flowing water running through it, and at that place there to break this young cow's neck. Now again, we're given some details without any explanation here. So as you can imagine, Bible teachers and commentators, when approaching passages like this, start to speculate a bit. One said, which I think was helpful, was the breaking of the neck is there to symbolize the punishment due to the murderer if he could be identified, but executed substitutionary on this substitute of the young cow. The blood of the heifer would fall on unplowed ground, which of course would absorb it, but it would disappear into the topsoil and in effect would be dissipated, washed away by the fact that this soil would be irrigated by running water nearby. Therefore, the blood wouldn't necessarily turn up in the future if this field was ploughed. But the image being presented here, the idea being presented here, was that in some sense this crime, though unidentified at the moment, deserved capital punishment. Verse 5 then says, "The Levitical priests shall step forward, for the Lord your God has chosen them to minister and to pronounce blessings in the name of the Lord and to decide all cases of dispute and assault." So he's simply saying that the priests are going to be involved in this. And they're going to be involved in this in the role as the Lord's representatives. Then the next verse 7 says, "Then all the elders of the town nearest the body shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the valley." So there's going to be hand washing. Now, obviously in Scripture, we know from many places that it symbolizes innocence or the cleansing of some kind. And then the next verse 8 says, "And they shall declare," so they're washing their hands over it, saying, "Our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done." So it's all very ritualistic, isn't it? But apparently there seems to be an implication that they were in some sense, because the murder has been identified as being having taken place on their land, or the land that they have spiritual responsibility over, that they had now become by it spiritually unclean, ritually unclean, and they needed to do this washing of the hands in this way to solve that problem. Now, if you know anything at all about the Mosaic legislation, you'll know that in the book of Leviticus, a great deal of it discusses about how things are clean and unclean, and how things can be made that are unclean can be made clean again. So, for example, if you touched a dead body, you were immediately what was called ceremonially unclean. And here we see the elders are going through a ritual to allow themselves and the land to become, in some sense, ceremonially clean again. One suggestion is that by washing their hands over this dead heifer, they presented their innocence of the crime and asked that no guilt of bloodshed should be attached to him. And it is this picture that we see Pilate doing over the responsibility for the death of Christ in the New Testament, isn't it? So even when the individual guilt in this situation, it couldn't even be ascertained, couldn't be confirmed, there was still some sort of corporate guilt that needed to be addressed by the responsible city stroke land. And that land was to be cleansed from the defilement that took place on their territory through the death of this heifer, whereby which they, the people, and the land could be again cleansed, be declared ceremonially clean. And verse 8 and 9 then tells us, "Accept this atonement for your people Israel, who you have redeemed, Lord, and do not hold your people guilty of the blood of this innocent person. Then the blood will be atoned for, and you will have purged yourself from the guilt of shedding innocent blood, since you have now done what is right in the eyes of the Lord." So this indicates that atonement for this situation, no one knows exactly how it happened, but something sinister happened, and atonement was made through these actions. Okay, that's the first case, an unsolved murder. The priests and the elders go out, first of all, measure the distance, establish who's responsible for investigating and whose guilt this event in the land fell upon. Then those people representing that community are to take out this young heifer, break its neck, and then wash their hands over the body. So what are we supposed to conclude from all this? Well, I think the observations that are to be drawn are, firstly, the city closest to the corpse has responsibilities. which means cities were responsible for accounting for all murders and deaths committed within their jurisdiction and addressing them in the appropriate way, taking them seriously. When there's an unsolved murder, the city, the community, and the government. And this would tell me today that when there is an unsolved murder in any community, then the city, the government, the community are to step in and investigate and deal with the situation. There seems to be an indication here that guilt, that any murder in the land, discovered or undiscovered, guilt is beyond just the individuals involved. The elders here are seen to wash their hands, even though they themselves didn't commit the murder. So some sort of corporate community guilt is ascribed here to the community in which events like this happen. You see, in God's government, the ritual prescribed removed the pollution that had been caused by this heinous act. They were, as a community, ceremonially sinfully stained by what had happened among them, and this ritual absolved them of that and made them ceremonially unclean. It had to be attested and accounted for. And apparently I would say that when heinous acts occur amongst our societies, communities, we all have to look to ourselves, because we are, in a sense, all responsible, and we're all responsible by making our communities and our societies safe places to live. Maybe for the first time in human history, we see that societies, communities, corporately should provide safeguards against this sort of thing happens. Maybe this is the first call in all of human literature for there to be some sort of community-based, police force, a proto-police force here, if you like, and all those other aspects and layers that create community safety and security, all of which are ways in which we are called to protect and serve one another. And lastly, and most importantly, this ritual demonstrates how extremely valuable God considers life. Think about it for a minute. This body, it's found out in the middle of a field. It's not brushed under the carpet, so to speak, if you don't mind me mixing my metaphor. It's not covered over and buried. The family, of course, would be concerned if they knew, and they would at least want to give it a proper burial. So in situations like this, the whole city has some sort of responsibility to deal with it. And this all implies to me that God has a very high view of the sacredness of life. This was a serious situation, even though the murderer was not found, but the land and the people in the community were in some way responsible, and some might say guilty, of what had occurred among them. And this animal sacrifices under this Old Testament covenant was needed as a way to provide for their atonement. The elders, the civic leaders, would make that atonement, and that indeed turned away the judgment of God from that community for any failings amongst them that had led to this sort of thing to happen. So that's the first of the 5 cases in this chapter. It's an unsolved murder, and we see that it should be treated with great seriousness. It wasn't a matter of finding a body and then treating it just as something worthless and discarding it and leaving it there. There was to rot and leaving it there to rot. There was to be an elaborate ritual over any unsolved death or murder among God's people. The second case is in Deuteronomy 21. Of our 5 we're going to look at today concerns the treatment of women prisoners of war. It says this: when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and you are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife, but bring her to your home and have her shave her head and trim her nails. It's really hard to figure out what's going on here from our modern sensibilities, but let's put it into its context. In those days, if you went out to war as a soldier and you were victorious, you had the rights to the spoils of war. And if you saw a beautiful woman among the captives and wanted to have her, under this commandment, you had to bring her home and marry her, but first you had to shave her head and cut her nails. So what do these acts of doing that have to do with the actual marriage? What's the significance of that? Well, we need to make some observation here. The first thing we need to notice, although it may be hard to see initially and pick it out, that God's creating a moral context for such things going on here. The first thing you have to notice is this soldier is a single man. The fact that he wants to marry her under Mosaic legislation means he must be single. Additionally, if you remember when we looked at Deuteronomy 20 yesterday, which gave some rules of engagement in terms of warfare and life, this specific command here is pertaining to cities far away, because we know already that God in the previous chapter had forbidden any possibility that they could marry Canaanite women. So given the context of chapter 20, from which this follows on, it's talking about the cities far off, as it mentioned. There's already been a prohibition given against marrying Canaanite women, so this is referring to those cities that lie outside the boundaries of Palestine itself, which they're about to go into and invade. So the soldier sees this woman, and the text tells us he is attracted to her. Now, the Hebrew word used here and translated attraction is a much more nuanced word than our modern word attracted would suggest. It actually means to long for. It means in many ways to love, to desire. So he has apparently seen this woman and fallen in love with her, and he wants to bring this woman home, and he wants to marry her. So what happens next? Well, verse 13 says, remember, he shaved her head and cut her nails, and it then says, put aside the clothes she's wearing when she's captured, and after she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. Now remember, this presupposes that this soldier isn't married, and it specifically says he wants to become her husband. Now, additionally to doing these things in terms of the shaving of the head and the removal of her clothes of the society in which she lived and replacing them with the attire of the woman of the nation of Israel, he has to additionally give her a month to mourn, suggesting that her family were probably killed in this battle. Now, this mourning period would be granted to allow her time to adjust psychologically to what had happened to this new situation, and even perhaps prepare her for marriage. You've got to remember the practice of taking women forcibly as wives, but sometimes just as sexual conquest, rape in other words, was common in the ancient world at that time. But this was putting brakes on this situation to give time for everyone to adjust and test this new relationship. Interestingly, one commentator I read suggested that the shaving of the lady's hair and the cutting of her nails would make her less attractive under the way woman attractiveness was measured at that time. This would give the soldier time to reflect on this decision, because it was believed at that time a woman's beauty was to a great extent encapsulated in the fullness of her hair. So this would give everyone in fact, a month to consider whether he truly wanted to marry this woman. What was it based on? Was the fact that shaving her head and trimming her nails, that might seem very odd to us, but it served a very practical purpose. Was this man just obsessed with this woman because of how she looked, or was there a deeper, more meaningful attraction here? One commentator noted that the Israelites were completely unique for this time in that they are commanded not to rape, plunder, or otherwise mistreat captives of other armies and the women of the people they captured during that time, completely at odds with what was going on in the ancient Near East at that time. This practice would protect the dignity of any woman brought into captivity, and this practice also stands in stark contrast to the cruel treatment of women captured in war among the neighbouring nations all around them at that time. Now, something interesting happens again, though, again in verse 14, the next verse. It says, if you're not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonoured her. So this implies that the soldier has taken her into captivity for the purpose of marriage, or maybe has even married her, and then after a period of time decides he no longer wants to be married to her. Well, this is saying, well, if that's the situation, you cannot sell her as a slave or otherwise mistreat her. So this is laying a principle by which there is no opportunity for a soldier to go through some sort of sham marriage in order for him, let me say it, to have his way with her, and then simply discard her afterwards, or worse still, profit from the situation by subsequently taking this woman and then selling her into slavery. So regardless of the reason, the woman who was held in this state was to retain a measure of dignity, even if she was subsequently divorced. So we have two cases so far out of the 5 we're going to look at today: an unsolved murder and an unwanted wife. The third case, which we're going to look at now, I'm going to call an unloved son, and it begins when we pick up the text in verse 15. Hi friends, welcome to today's continuation of the study we began yesterday, looking at these 5 disparate laws that overall I believe are there primarily actually to demonstrate the sacredness of life. We looked at the first of the 2 yesterday concerning unsolved murders, and also some issues around the taking of women prisoners of war and how that should be, how shall we say, ethically controlled. And today I'm just going to pick up exactly where we faded out last time and look at the 3 other guidelines contained in this chapter. One concerning a first son's inheritance, the other concerning how to deal with a continually rebellious and disobedient son, and then wrapping it up with some further rules about dealing with someone, the body of someone who has committed the most heinous of sins. So welcome back to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. That's 2 cases so far. We've seen the unsolved murder, and how shall I describe it, this unwanted, what has ultimately become an unwanted wife. The third case, what I'm going to look at, is called the unloved son, and it begins in verse 15. It says, if a man has 2 wives and loves one but not the other, and both bear him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the wife he does not love, when he wills his property to his sons, he must give the rights of the firstborn to the son of the wife he loves, in preference to the actual firstborn, the son of the wife he does not love. He must acknowledge the son of his unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double share of all he has. The son is the first sign of his father's strength. The right of the firstborn belongs to him. Are you confused by all this? Well, let me explain. Very simply, this man has 2 wives, which today we call polygamy, a topic I'll address separately in a moment, but just take it as face value as read at the moment. Each of these 2 wives that he's married to has a son, but the wife loves one wife more than the other. Now, according to Mosaic law, no matter the circumstances, the firstborn son was to receive a double portion of the inheritance. So this case presents this scenario, are you following, where the firstborn son is from this less loved wife. And it's saying, despite the man's feeling, the law, the Mosaic law, still requires that the firstborn status and its privileges go to the true firstborn son, regardless of his attitude or the mother's status. Of course, the man might be tempted to give the firstborn status to the son of the wife he loves the most, but Moses makes it clear that the true firstborn, even if it's from the unloved wife, should receive their complete inheritance rights. Now, that's the scenario. Let me address for a moment the fact that this man has 2 wives. The first thing I should say is one should not interpret God's legislation regarding the rights of sons born into polygamous families as in any way an approval of polygamy itself. Let's be clear, right from the very beginning of the Bible, monogamy is declared as God's perfect will for us. He does not approve of polygamy, but he does tolerate it. It's seen in ancient Israel, and it is not necessarily punished through civil procedures. But there are lots of things that God doesn't necessarily approve of, but he tolerates. God does not approve of divorce in any ways, but he does allow for it in certain cases. It's helpful to note that God does not always feel compelled to comment on every single sinful practice in Scripture wherever it occurs. This is especially true when it comes to people's sins that have relatively limited consequences other than for the individual who is the sinner. He does tend to get involved, he does tend to comment when sins involve the person's relationship with him, or they have wider catastrophic effects on other people or the wider society in which they live. The husband in this passage is simply being told he has not allowed to follow his feelings and disregard the law. He must acknowledge the son of the first unloved wife as the firstborn, and do that practically by giving him a double portion of all he has. So the key point here is that the father's authority, although important as head of the family, is not absolute. He is not the top of the hierarchy. He must adhere to the law, ensuring that God holds his place and ensuring that the unloved son is treated with dignity and given his rights under the Mosaic law, which again underscores the sanctity and the importance of life. Okay, that's event 3. Now let's come to event 4, and we come to the case of what I'm describing as a disobedient and rebellious son. So reading verses 18 to 21, it tells us, if someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother, and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious, and he will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town are to stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. Now this is a case of good, godly parents having a bad son. Can good parents, godly parents, have bad children, disobedient children? Absolutely. And this passage clearly states that these parents are good people. They have treated all their children equally, and they have disciplined their their children, including the son, when it's appropriate, in the appropriate manner. But even after all that, he still remained rebellious. Verse 20 indicates to me that there's a long history of rebellion here, not just a single instance, which end up meaning the parents actually end up by taking their son to the elders of the city, akin to taking him to City Hall and saying, help us sort this out. This teaches that parents must prioritize their love for Lord above their love for their children, and they ultimately must follow God's directive. Now, the case of this rebellious, remember, unresponsive son, even though he's been coaxed, encouraged, disciplined, demonstrate principles of justice and the sanctity of life. And even in complex family dynamics, and that's where it gets most complicated in life for most of us, God's law must still ensure dignity and fairness. So what are the men, the elders of the city, supposed to do in this situation? Well, it's really a pretty intense situation. It's been taken out. It's obviously had a carryover, his behavior, to affect the whole society. And the scenario here, there's the rebellious child. For him, the penalty is death. You see, the original commandment, which was very clearly given, is honor your father and the mother. But in this case, we've seen an extreme case of it is suggested years of rebellion, drunkenness and gluttony, and ancient Israel was declared not to be allowed to tolerate such behavior. So in this scenario, the son was to be stoned. Now, I do have to add at this point, and this is important, there is no record of this punishment actually being carried out in the biblical literature or in the supporting historical documents of people who analysed the Jewish nation at that time historically. Several scholars and Bible authorities have all noted that there's no evidence in the Bible or extra biblical literature to indicate that this punishment was ever enacted. It's the principle that's being addressed here and the potential of how serious it is that it could lead to this type of punishment in theory. And what is important here is it's saying that rejecting the authority of the parents and the hierarchy of the community will affect that entire community, because at the top of that hierarchy, of course, lies God himself and his principles. This threat of this ultimate punishment is meant to serve as a deterrent. Even if the punishment was never carried out, it's just stated as the possibility of a threat that could be enacted out. And I think that's really what's going on here. So this passage supports the idea that anarchy in the home, if not dealt with early on, will breed anarchy in the wider society. And that is what makes this a serious matter. The ultimate responsibility at the end, if the infection spreads out into the community, goes from out of the hands of the parents and on to the responsibility of the community itself. That's an interesting concept, isn't it? Now, there's just one more case, and I'm going to call this one the unconventional death. So reading the last couple of verses, 22 and 23 for you. It says, if someone guilty of a capital offence is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse, and you must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as his inheritance. Notice this passage carefully. Hanging him on a tree is not the cause of death here. He's committed a crime worthy of death, he's been put to death, and then subsequently they hang him on a tree. In the previous case, one of the methods of death described was stoning. Hanging here on a tree is different. So why hang him on a tree afterwards? Well, verse 23 explained that the purpose of hanging him on a tree after death was to show that that person, by their actions, was accursed by God. Again, saying life is sacred and you ultimately need to handle it with care. If someone has done something so heinous, has taken a life in such a way that it has violated the Old Testament covenant, then they deserve for their life to be taken. And this hanging on the pole says there needs to be public recognition of this, because that is the only thing that will act as a deterrent for others. Hanging on a tree signifies being that person died accursed by God. Now, even if you're not familiar with the concept here in Deuteronomy, you must recognize this concept from the New Testament and what the Romans attempted to do to Jesus by hanging him on a cross. Okay, we've covered a lot today, and let me try and summarize it. In this chapter, we see God instructing the Israelites how to handle an unsolved murder, an unwanted wife, an unloved son, an unresponsive son to discipline, and a murderer, a feral child, and a murderer. And these 5 cases signpost on a practical level, all of them, the thread that runs through them is, look, God is saying life is sacred. Now, the passage does not directly correct the 5 cases to the creation in Genesis, but others before me who have studied this, and I too am suggesting today, that the underlying principle unpacked here is the value of the sacredness of life, as outlined in the 6th commandment, which most Bible experts say these chapters are dealing with. You see, human beings are created in the image of God. That's what the Bible says, and it is that means that human life is sacred. Communities also are revealed here as having a responsibility to address such transgressions seriously, with the teaching here on dealing with unsolved murders and the likes of the case at the end. Also, these other things talk about an untreated wife, a woman brought into captivity through war, is still to be treated with dignity and respect because she too is made in the image of God. An unloved son still has rights, even if there are other children from other wives later. Rebellion against authority and murder is not to be tolerated within our families and communities, and those who commit such acts deserve punishments that serve as deterrents. But I think that the sacredness of life is the thread that's running through all these 5 cases. The principle of being made in the image of God is that which makes human life valuable and sacred and different from that of animals. What struck me is this: you shalt not murder is a very general statement. It's the core principle revealed in the 6th commandment, and it is that 6th commandment that underscores the sacredness of life. But what does that really mean when the rubber hits the road? Obviously, it means that we shouldn't kill people. In that sense, murder is wrong. But there are also practical ramifications. Because life is sacred, it means this principle applies to many various and varied situations. Like when there's an unsolved murder, like when we've seen here there's an unwanted wife, like there are multiple sons from multiple wives, some of whom those wives are loved and not loved anymore. All these specific scenarios illustrate how the sacredness of life needs to translate into practical everyday situations. So in this chapter, we've seen how the general principle is now broken down for us into specific actional guidelines. Often we find general principles stated in the Bible, but particularly in the New Testament, we are encouraged by the teachings of Christ and the letters to meditate on these principles. Well, day and night, Paul tells us. And part of that meditation involves thinking about how these principles need to be unpacked and applied in practical everyday situations. And I've only given you 5 today from this Old Testament passage. Another example of this would be found in the very simple command in the New Testament when Jesus says to husbands, love your wives. But what does that mean in practical terms? The only hint given is in the passages that husbands are told to love their wives as like Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So that it seems for me to love my wife, it must be to the point of sacrificing myself for her. But what are the practical specifics that rise out of understanding the love principle? Well, I'm going to close by having a quick look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, because that is the great famous chapter that provides specific on what love should really look like. Now, I'm not going to read it to you. Go read it yourself if you have a moment. But to close today, I would simply like to summarize and paraphrase what I think this famous passage teaches us about love. You see, the Corinthians he's writing to were envious, jealous, boastful, proud, arrogant, rude, self-seeking. He says all of this in the introduction, only looking to their own interests. Their behavior, he's ultimately saying, is you're not being loving. Love does not deal with people in a way that injures their dignity. That's the thread that's running through and ran through in the Old Testament passage we've just looked at. Love does not insist on having its own way, nor does it put one's own interest above the needs of others. Love is not irritable, it's not touchy. Love is not easily provoked to arrogance or to take offense. It does not insult, it does not inconvenience others for the sake of ourselves. Also, love does not keep a record of the offenses against us. It does not pay back evil with evil, but with love. Love takes no delight in evil, takes no delight in the misfortune of others, but takes great pleasure in just simply doing what is right. Love cannot in any way share the glee of the fall of a sinner. Love absolutely rejects all rejoicing over evil, and of gossiping about the misdeeds of others. It is never glad when someone else falls or fails. Love stands on the side of the gospel and always looks for mercy and justice in every situation, including with those people with whom we disagree. Christian love does not wish ever to conceal the truth. Of course, it's brave enough to face the truth, but it never rejoices in wrongdoing or bringing people down who are in error, but rejoices by introducing them to the truth. Love tries to hover on worthy things rather than just bringing them into the light and magnifying them for others to cast judgment or to persecute them. It puts up with everything and is always even eager to believe the best of other people, even when we don't have evidence of seeing it. This passage in Corinthians also tells us love believes all things, and we should always put the most favourable construction on all our actions. It's always hopeful that those who fail will not fail again, rather than simply concluding that their failure is inevitable. Love does not allow itself to become overwhelmed. It persists, it preserves, it steadfastly works through difficult trials, and he also tells us that love will endure all things. Do those phrases, those description of love, does that resonate with you? You see, these nuances of what is unpacked from the basic command to love one another, our husbands to love our wives, gets down to much more of the nitty-gritty of what love looks like in practical terms. We talk about loving one another, but this passage tells us that we are meant to do it practically and apply it across a myriad and wide-ranging group of situations. So let us always underpin everything we do. Let us respect and acknowledge and love all other human beings, because we know that they, like us, are made in the image of God. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, friends, that's it for today. Thanks for being with me. I do hope you found that helpful. We're going to continue tomorrow looking at Deuteronomy 22 when we look at these other various laws, including some laws concerning sexual purity. I'm so glad you've decided to join with me today, and I do hope that if you've not already done so, you'll make the decision to make the study of the Bible part of your everyday life. Make it part of the rhythm of your everyday life, as I describe it. And you can do that by subscribing for free to get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. That way, you will have made the decision to make the journey through the Bible your adventure, your goal, over the next 7 years or so. We're over 3 years into this project. You're very welcome to go back to the very start and work through the whole Bible and play catch-up for a while. You can choose to do this at whatever pace suits you. If you do go back to the beginning, you'll notice, first of all, there's a 66 episode introductory season, which is 66 short 6 to 8 minute podcasts, each giving an overview of each of the 66 books of our Bible. After that, we launch out on alternate seasons through New Testament and Old Testament books. So we've gone Genesis, Matthew, Exodus, Mark, Leviticus, Luke. You get the picture, continuing on from there. There are also some bonus seasons in between, which is my pattern that whenever I finish a major season, I usually take a little bit of time out and use some episodes that have previously been exclusively only available on Patreon to sort of populate that period of time, to give me some preparation and study time before launching off from the next season. Anyway, having said all that, the main thing is I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad you've made that decision. I hope you're getting as much out of it as I am in the preparation of these studies. And can I remind you that you can reach out and connect to me by visiting the homepage of the podcast, which is the Bible Project at buzzsprout.com. There's a secure link there to send me a message. Perhaps tell me about what this podcast has meant for you and your own personal walk with the Lord. But also, if you really want to get involved in my life and my ministry at a more involved level, know everything I'm doing across all the podcasts I do, the place to do that is over on Patreon. Now, Patreon's free to join. You can follow me over there and you'll have access to pretty much everything I do. You will initially get access to an ad-free version of this podcast and the other podcast I do, my History of the Christian Church podcast. But as well as that, you'll have access to lots of free resources, like a study notes and study guide to each episode, as well as, in fact, a full transcript of everything I've said, all of which is copyright free. There's also lots of bonus material. It's initially put on for a period of time as a thank you to those who choose to select one of the subscription tiers where they actually financially support my ministry. They start from just a couple of dollars a month. But by all means, if you don't feel God's calling you to do that, just use it as an opportunity to get the ad-free version and to maybe reach out and connect with me on a more meaningful level. Because it is over there I'm able to join in conversations with people about what I'm doing and what I hope we're able to do together. I think it's worth saying that I do not respond to contacts on social media. There is a Facebook account and all those other things, but I don't actually respond to inquiries over there. There are thousands of people on those accounts, and most of the inquiries, well, A, I don't even know if they're from real people half the time, and secondly, social media has been so problematic for me in the past. It's not places where I have conversations. But the main thing is that you've made the decision to join me in this amazing journey through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And I do trust and hope I'll see you back here again every day, each and every day, as we journey together through the whole Bible on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.